Hey folks, welcome back. Today we're diving into the practice of bibliomancy, most specifically alongside card divination, so tarot and oracle, although if there's any other cards you use, that too. This is reflective of my practice, so I'm going to touch on, aside from some sort of general introductions, how I go about it, and then of course if you're someone who has already tried this, then you can let me know how it is you approach it, if we have any similarities, if we have any differences. This has been one of those topics that I've had earmarked for a really long time in my list of things that I would like to talk about eventually. And sometimes I just dive into that list and pluck something from it, and I'm constantly adding to it as well. So it felt like a good time, especially where I'm not making content in December because the Patreon's going to be paused. So perhaps if you've never tried this before, it can be something that you could try in December. Just a thought. Before we dive into how I go about any of this, just for those who might not be familiar with the term bibliomancy or the practice, bibliomancy is the use of books in divination. If you research it, a lot of the initial offerings that come up talk about sacred texts, religious texts, magical texts. Of course, you can use any kind of text, and your approach can vary quite widely. There are even books that are made specifically for bibliomantic purposes, but it's the process of going through, and I imagine that you could do it very consciously, but usually I would approach it by sort of thumbing through, finding a page that I landed on, and then dependent on how I'm working with the book, what style the book is, I will either take all of the text or I will just see what stands out to me. Dispute and young woman stood out to me, so then let's take this out. I would just take a particular sentence and that would be the divinatory message. A lot of people just use bibliomancy solely on its own, and there are varying reasons that I might do that. In the same way that whilst this is perhaps not bibliomancy, it's perhaps adjacent, I will do that with my poetry books a lot. I do consider some of them to be poetic invitations, and I can take a divinatory message from them, but it depends on the type of poetry. But certainly if I'm using a book for that on its own, that's one of the most common things I'll do, is just flick through and see what poem I land on, what sort of energy it leaves me with, what the invitation is from that particular book. So that's a real kind of baseline to what bibliomancy is. I am sure that there are people that have done very specific in-depth discussions of it, but as always, I much prefer inviting you into my practice and how I approach things. And then of course, I love hearing about how you approach things, if they differ, if they're the same, what the nuances are. We can share ideas. And hopefully, even though it's not an introduction guide in the same capacity, for anyone who hasn't tried this before, it will, I feel, offer enough to help you get into it and give it a try. So that's the kind of what is bibliomancy. And then I was asked by one of our lovely members if I had any particular favourite books for this, and if I had any favourite pairings. In terms of books, yes. In terms of pairings, no. So let's start with the books. We are looking at one of my favourites, and that's because earth medicine is a really interesting array of poetry, prose, medicine-based invitations, and I don't want to say magical exploration, but that kind of work. It just lends itself to this kind of thing quite a bit. I'm not sure how many people will be familiar with this book. It's a very old one. Jamie Sams is one of the two people who also did the medicine cards. And so you can actually work with this book through the moon cycles, or you can do what I do and kind of bibliomancy it and be a bit haphazard, because I've tried to commit to working with this every single day and it never happens. But I really love it for bibliomancy, especially because it's got that kind of variety between all of my favourite books that I use for that. This one's got that mishmash. This is more a representation. Like I said, I really, really love poetry for bibliomancy. Poetry is just one of those ways that my soul sort of sings, and I really do feel like I get messages from it. I also feel like it's a great invitation for cathartic acknowledgement and expression, to move something energetically or emotionally, just all of those shifts. I actually experience similar with a lot of song lyrics, and I would just love to create a book of all of my favourite songs, in terms of the ones that have my favourite lyrics, you know, because I like songs that the lyrics aren't great or they're nonsense or repetitive, but there are some that are just sheer poetry. I've been listening to a lot of 𝗵𝘁𝗺𝗺 recently, and her songs could be in a book like this, and I would definitely use them in that way. It just feels really rich in its expression. So I suppose that's what I mean. And I would pick a page and go to the whole poem. I have used this particular one, which is by Kjell Claesen, and sort of honed in on a sentence before, but more often than not I will take the whole thing in. And then one of my absolute favourites, which is one that I get perhaps the most questions about, women who run with the wolves. And with this one, I will find a page, open it, and then my eyes will just naturally take me to somewhere. So, Weeping Woman. How much of this I take in really is just intuited in the moment. It might be that it's literally just a sentence and that's enough, and it says everything that I need to. Whereas this one, I would perhaps be reading a little bit more. It's talking about an old Spanish spoken tale rather. And then it gets to the discussion of the river of life that became a river of death. So I would definitely continue reading that. Haunted river, woman who is fertile and generous, creating out of her own body. She is poor, breathtaking, beautiful, but rich in soul and spirit. I imagine I'd finish around here, just as an example. I think that it's just enough for me to land upon where I've got a message that makes sense to me, because of course this book is weaving much larger stories, and so occasionally I will come across something that's giving me some context in terms of what Clarissa's talking about, and so it's just kind of moving past the context and getting into the offering. And once I've hit that, I'm very much kind of sated. That's enough, and that's how I use this. This has been just an absolute favourite, honestly. I freaking love this for this practice. Run with the Wolves is without doubt one of my favourites. Like I said, poetry, just all and any poetry. Then I wasn't going to talk about it until the end, but because we're talking about books, actually it makes more sense now. This, I suppose you could argue it is and it isn't bibliomancy, but technically it is still a divinatory way to use a book that is not necessarily intended in that capacity. And so I feel like it's still a worthwhile offering. Also, it's a really prime example of, say you've got more books or just more access to books than you do decks, especially for people who are really kind of prolific with borrowing from the library and don't necessarily want or have the funds or needs or desire for certain types of decks. You can very much replace one for the other. So with the Witch's Garden, which this was a beautiful gift from a dear friend. It was a belated birthday present, if I'm remembering correctly. So the way that I might use this in a divinatory way, and I have, which has sort of introduced me to the book rather than reading it cover to cover, is again to open at a page. Because I pulled it open here and it doesn't mention either of the plants that are depicted, I would go to the closest page, which is this one, and it says walnut. So what I would consider this is as an invitation to work with walnut. Now this can be in replacement of a plant, herb, tree deck, you know. It's a really lovely way to just see what plant comes through in this instance. And as you can see, this book talks and offers quite a lot of information about each of them. So I've got a really nice starting point. The chapters are broken up into specific focuses as well, but there's generally a plant at some point on, if not on the page that I open it to, on the next page. That's my thing for the month, week, I don't know, insert however long you're going to work with it. This is an example for me of a book that I wouldn't necessarily use by coming to a page and then just getting a tiny bit of bibliomantic information from it, because I don't feel like this book lends itself to that kind of work, just for me. But like I said, it's a really great way to, I have a few plant decks, but it's a really great way to just grab a book off of the shelf, open it, be like, I really fancy working with a plant, don't know what to focus on, open the book and work with wherever I land. Not only am I going to get an initial source of information as well, but then I can go and expand upon that. Like I say, it's not really bibliomancy in the same way, but it is something that I wanted to put out there, because you could even get a plant or animal encyclopedia, I don't know, a bird spotting book, you name it, riffle through, see what you land on, that's your animal that you're going to work with, learn about, incorporate into your practice, do all of those wonderful gnosis things. So like I said, not quite bibliomancy in the same way, but it is a discussion of books and a divinatory kind of way of approaching them. So I just wanted to add that in. In regards to deck pairings, I don't have a favourite book to deck pairing. So I'm definitely not going to make anything up. The reason being is I'll have gravitated towards usually a deck, but sometimes a book. It depends on what comes first, and that's something we're going to get into. But whatever I've gravitated towards, I'm focusing on that, and then I'll simply look across to either the other item. So if I've got my 𝗪𝗔 tarot out and that's what I'm using, and then I want a bibliomancy message, I will simply look over to my bookshelf and see what catches my eye, or what kind of bibliomancy I want to do, whether it's more like the poetry stuff, like I said, or whether it's more to get a very specific message that's kind of going to add an evolution to my reading. And there is no set way that I've done that, other than to say that the Women Who Run with Wolves is the one that I repeatedly go back to. So it kind of gets paired with a lot of my decks. There's no one and done way. I'm sure that there are pairings that might work better if I was going to approach it in certain ways, but honestly, I'm very free-flowing with a lot of those things, especially nowadays. So yeah, there's no favourite book to deck pairings, unfortunately, but that does mean that we can get into my approach now. I think the biggest question for the approach is generally what comes first. Do I do the reading and then the bibliomancy, or is the bibliomancy the initiator? And I want to say, like, 9 out of 10 times, even if I could get closer to 10, just not always without fail, it's going to be the deck. It's always going to be the deck, pretty much, except from those few exceptions. So I might shuffle, I'm not going to shuffle for every card, although that is something I do. In fact, let's just start with a very simple example. We do the 1 card pull and we get 9 of Wands. In fact, it's especially helpful with 1 card pulls because sometimes, especially when I'm doing such a general pull and I haven't added any kind of question, prompt, instructional direction to that, I've just pulled the 9 of Wands and I'm like, okay, then it's a really interesting experience to see what the Bibliomancy adds to the nuance. You know, where does it take that path? What is it telling me about my experience of the 9 of Wands in this given moment? And I really like that for it. It's almost, it doesn't become its spread, it doesn't become its question, but it does become a direction. I just feel like that's the best way to explain it. So, I'm very familiar with this Tao in particular. So it says here, because this is where my eyes went straight away, Bluebeard shouts for his wife and begins to clomp up the stone steps. His wife cries to her sister, and now, do you see them now? And her sisters cry down, yes, we see them now. They are almost here. Her brothers gallop down the hall. They charge into her room and drive Bluebeard out into the parapet. Of course, for a video, I would land on something I can't say. There with swords they kill him and leave what is left of him for the carrion eaters. And that's actually where I would stop for this particular, I mean, the brutality of that moment, although I am very familiar with this story, so it very much comes to a, you kind of had it coming, dude, kind of vibe. But in terms of the 9 of Wands, and the 9 of Wands in the Риder-Waite-Smith, and the acknowledgement of very brutal, sometimes challenges, and the energetic weight and the burden of those processes, and how we continue to sort of try and hold them as we're pushing through to that last moment, to that last thing, to completion, whether that's completion and a breath of relief, if that's completion in a very unfulfilling end. I really think that part is open for interpretation, but there's something about this final push and this gallop and this charge and something being ended, you know, something being left as carry on, something being left to the crows, left to the magpies, you know. I feel like that to me tells me that I'm feeling a lot of I'm feeling a lot of brutality in my experience of the world at the moment. Not outwardly, I don't feel brutal. I feel like the brunt of certain things have worn and weathered and weighed down my energy, and I can feel my willpower sort of trying to push through, but feeling a lot of resistance and a lot of pushback. And yet knowing that it needs to happen, and there's something that I'm moving towards, and there's something worth moving towards, and there's kind of a struggle to sort of be and endure, and at the same time wanting to almost like cut away an experience. I know that's quite a heavy reading. I'm trying to share genuinely what's coming up, because of course for these videos I find it impossible to give examples that don't end up being relevant, and therefore it's tapped into some stuff that's going on at the moment. There's a lot of fluidity to how I would do this, and I might have carried on reading if I didn't feel that I had got enough from it. It's not very often I would then pull another card, but I might. I don't really have too many hard and fast rules for this process, but that's an example of, like, especially a very non-specific, singular, or even if it had been several card pull, I feel like this adds another dimension to it. I will do another example, Do we use women who run with wolves, or is it going to is it going to do the same thing? Let's stick with tarot for the time being. Now I could add it to a spread if I wanted to. I could do like a stop start and then the bibliomancy as an advice, I guess. Or I could do a stop start advice spread and then add a bibliomantic flair. But I'm going to go for the first one. So I'm going to go stop the Hermit. I'm going to go start with the King of Wands. It's a Wandsy kind of moment. Oh, that's it. Nearly forgot what I was doing. And then I'm going to go with the women who run with wolves. So stop start. It could be very simple here because again I don't want to go into like these huge readings in an example, but I do want to show you. So of course stop. I am very hermity at the moment, perhaps a little bit to my detriment. I don't think that it's necessarily all of what I'm doing in the Hermit though. I think that sometimes we can simplify the Hermit into being away from others and its very physical meaning. And on the same vein, it's a very introspective card, and there is a point of introspection that's not healthy for any of us. And also there are times when it's just not as helpful as well. I think physically it's a bit difficult. I can't really do anything about being hermity because I can't really get about at the moment. But in terms of introspection and how much of my narrative is just going on with myself because I'm not really having as much engagement with other people as I usually would through the social means that I can, so through my phone and stuff. Perhaps that's not as helpful because it creates that kind of echo chamber in a way where if your thoughts are particularly dark or heavy or unhelpful, there's not really any break from them. Also, it's very self-focused at points. I'm not saying it's entirely always bad, but of course there are points when it's too much. And the King of Wands for me to start doing, I mean, the King of Wands has always felt very innovative to me, very, I don't think charismatic is exactly the word that I want, because charisma feels a little bit more Knight of Wandsy to me, although I think all of the Wands cults have a certain charisma that comes through, for me, in the fire, in the passion. And there's kind of this trailblazing, that's what I wanted. It's innovative, it's trailblazing. I think I've got to a point in burnout where I've kind of decided that I don't have those things at the moment, so perhaps this is a call into remembering how I do have the capacity for that, and that just because my mind says, oh, this is not the case, that doesn't make it true. You know, they are separate facets of something that all exists within me, and when I'm giving too much attention to perhaps more a mind-based one and less of a more creative, passion focused, you know, where my drive is kind of would be taking me if I wasn't kind of ignoring it. It's a bit of a weird one because when I feel burnt out, it feels like none of that exists. And I suppose that's the story I tell myself, that when I'm burnt out, I have no drive, I have no willpower, I have no innovation to give, to have, to experience. So I feel like it's, in a weird way, it's kind of guiding me towards that. And so the advice, that is why it is imperative to stop in the midst of it all, withdraw and take solitude. It's too much to try to fight and handle feeling gut shot at the same time. A woman who has climbed the mountain withdraws, deals with the older event first, then the more recent event, decides her position, shakes out her ruff, puts up her ears, and goes back out to act with dignity. Well, fuck me. It was almost like it was reminding me the use of the solitude and how the story traverses from one to the other. Like, the advice was really how do I get from this and all of the nourishment or the safety that I've got from this into this, and really specifically, what is it that I'm trying to find here as I shake out my rough and I put up my ears and I go back to act with dignity. I don't feel like I could have landed on a better page. I don't even know what to say. I'm having a whole freaking moment with my own, with my own reading. I'm not even adding to that. I'm sorry if you're disappointed. That couldn't have been more spot on. So good. Hopefully that gives you more of an idea of like some of the approach layers. You know, I should probably stop using this book and move on to another one, but it's so good. It's so freaking good. If I was going to do it the other way round, perhaps we won't use Women Who Run With Wolves with this. We will use earth medicine. If I get the urge to work with the Bibliomancy first, then I'm really looking to expand upon the message that I'm getting from the Bibliomancy. So here we've got Sun-setting Woman. Keeper of tomorrow's dreams, mother of star-filled night, show me how to live my truth and bring my dreams to light. Teach me how to use my will, live in the truth I find within, discovering all the parts of me, where light and shadow blend. Let me sing the song of future, with concern for what will be, upholding all of nature's laws, for creatures, stones and trees. Mother, I see you in the sunset, I hear you in the rain, you teach me inner knowing, through your heart's sweet refrain. And then it goes on to talk about this particular sun-setting woman and the story. It talks about more growth, changes, what can happen with fragmentation and separation of the self, not being able to change others, but individually we can reclaim our wholeness. So it's a wholeness that's a more self-care focused, I suppose, in this particular instance. But it also says, is it time to provide for the generations that will follow you by making your healing choices today? So that kind of acknowledgement that how can you heal a wound, a part of your history, of your story, of your narrative, so that that is not something that you keep putting out into the world, which is good invitation for all of us. We're going to use that antler just to keep the page there for me. And I'm going to shuffle the cards. Okay, that's a very, very open invitation to growth and change through tending the self. A great example of how kind of vast that particular bibliomancy could be, and a reason why I wouldn't use that book perhaps necessarily on its own unless I was doing it for a poetic reason. So I'm going to pull a few cards, and they're going to again add that dimension and that direction, hopefully anyway. This is a returning card of mine lately. So I've got decay and I've got spores, but what I enjoy about this is that there are 3 keywords. So we've got transformation, merging, circularity, opportunity, luck and diffusion. These kind of challenge each other as well, because we're talking about emergence in one sense, which you could think of emergence in intricative healing, because when we try and reject facets of ourselves, we usually unknowingly reject a part of us in its entirety. It's not about having to keep everything we don't like, but being honest about where we've been or who we are or that kind of thing is healthier if we integrate it. And then the diffusion, I suppose, of this, if we call it wound, which I know it didn't say wound, it spoke about dreams, but it also said about where light and shadow blend, which is really great for like transformation, because you don't have one without the other and vice versa. I like that, the acknowledgement of both of those. But what comes to mind for me is that when we're transforming, I feel like it's just as easy to transform with a wound in an unhelpful capacity as it is in a helpful one. You know, a lot of it is to do with where we're at any given time, and a lot of our defences that are born of these things as well, which is not to say that they're wrong, but they don't always remain helpful. They can be born of times when we're not very conscious about what's going on, or we don't have the capacity to have control over that. And when we get to a stage where we do, and it's safer for us to return to that, then we want to kind of diffuse that emergence and create a new loop, a new cycle, a new transformation that is more beneficial for us, so that, like it said, our choices for our healing then benefit those that we're in relationships with, and those who we teach and we love and we look after and we bring up or engage with, whatever it is. I do feel that this is still very, very non-specific, and that's why I tend to prefer using the deck first and the Bibliomancy second. However, in this instance, just going with the flow of what I'm feeling, I would probably say, okay, well, this is all very well and nice. I didn't give myself enough direction, or whatever it is, picked it up the wrong way. So I am going to flick that around quickly and say that it said the Magician. Okay, so there's very much about tapping into what I already have in my skill set rather than things without. So this is not a learning process of something new that I don't already know, or I can't already attain, that I don't already have the capacity for, which is good because, like I said, feeling rather burned out at the moment. This brings me back to body. It brings me back to what I need to feel abundance and safety and nourishment in my body, and all of the things that I have perhaps not been doing so much in terms of the tools at my disposal. I'm fortunate enough to be able to eat better than I'm eating. That's a really good example. I'm not going to go into it, and like I said, I'm really not going to shame myself because fuck, it's been heavy lately, but I've not been eating well. That's it's not the worst way. It's not causing my body's issues for sure, but there's nourishment that I could be getting. There's warmth that I could be getting. There is less belly aches that I could be getting that are a part of my toolkit of things that I can do. Exercise wouldn't be a part of this, but physio stretches, I have gone very literal with this, but physio stretches. And in terms of my environment, I was just looking around today because the material world around me is very small at the moment because I'm mostly indoors, and thinking, you know, I probably need to just tidy up the couple of bits that have got messy and make my space feel a little bit more inviting again, perhaps get something a bit more colourful in here, make the mood a little bit more inviting, put something on the floor for when I'm stretching so that I don't just feel like I'm laying on the floor. And these are ways to bring me back to a sense of safety and a sense of coming, because the particular self-tending wound that I'd be focused on, it all comes back to this relationship with being unwell and the messages of worth or lack of that I have around that, just to give you a bit of an example. And also this kind of sense of decay is a theme in itself at the moment. I don't know if that was quite easy for you to track, because the way that I read for myself can get real layered, and these are things that I work with over a really long period of time usually, and the intention wasn't really like to see how I read, but I wanted to show you it in practice so that, yeah, it just gives you some ideas of how bibliomancy shows up in my practice. Honestly, I think that they are the main ways that I go about it. I did have another deck out, so I will just add that. Another deck that I use with bibliomancy or bibliomancy adjacent things very frequently is the 𝗪𝗓𝗇 oracle, because this is this is a deck of symbols. it works really, really well with a symbol dictionary to just add something that may not be in here. But also, it's like another layer of language, especially if I'm doing like spirit work and I'm speaking to the spirits in symbols and I want to add to like how they're tethered together. Again, Bibliomancy is really great for that. And like I said, I really love the poems for it. Perhaps I'll show you one way with the poems and how I may use this in my workings. A lot of the time, if I'm using this deck, especially if it comes up with like tools, herbs, animals, things like that, I will tend to extend that into like a magical working for myself. And I appreciate not everyone here does ritual stuff like that, practices witchcraft of any sort or paganism or whatever like branch of that. Perhaps you don't have one at all. I will show you anyway. Honeycomb heart is just so good. So I feel like I focused on 10 because these are just, the names of these are literally numbered. And this says, do not offer me your love and light unless you are willing to also offer me your grief and rage. Because love and light without grief and rage are just platitudes. Without grief and rage, there is no marrow, no meat, no gristle. Nothing for me to sharpen the teeth of my heart against. Give me love and light, certainly, but let it be nourished, let it be fueled, and let it be made real by your grief and rage. Oh, I love it. I love her work anyway. Her animal deck is wicked as well. So I didn't keep it open because I get the essence of that. It's nice and quick. Sorry about the glare. There we go. What will help me be with nourishing the grief and rage and acknowledging it just as much as the love and light? I pull a lot from these, by the way, so I was thinking it was giving me more of a message, which I would take a message from this as well. I'm not going to go into it because I have done enough sharing of my readings, and as you can probably tell, there's a theme coming through. Maybe you can't tell, and it would be really interesting to hear, but for me, they've kind of strung together in a way that makes enough sense, but of course I'm the person experiencing it, so I don't know. I love working with coffin nails. I think mine are coffin nails. Anyway, I actually have one here, but it's a part of a ritual, so I'm going to borrow it and pop it back really quickly. It's an iron nail. It's designed like a coffin nail. I use pins and needles a lot, especially since doing some folk study about it. I know this sounds strange because this is an angel card, and it's not always the message that I get from it, but because I've got the health stuff, the plague doctor stuff, the gloves, protecting my hands whilst getting them dirty kind of vibe, I actually would create this into a ritual. One of the things that I was thinking about is the leftover pet cemetery dirt that I have. I do actually have owl feathers. I do have coffin nails. I do think that there could be some catharsis in terms of planting the rage into something. See, really visceral. Perhaps the protective element is like sprinkling the dirt over it, but then temporarily people will know if I am burying something and it's not entirely like earth friendly, then I will bury it in a pot that nothing else can get to, and then I will remove it from the pot when it's finished with, dismantle and bin correctly. There is no excuse to bury something in the actual earth that is not earth friendly, but that's another topic. But just something with it. It doesn't even have to be buried, but it is a vibe I'm getting, sprinkling the dirt over it and then calling in owl in particular. And I wouldn't have the feathers in the actual ritual part that I'm envisioning in my head, but I would use it in the process of once I'd finished and then taking it apart again as a kind of, I use feathers a lot for directional stuff. I use feathers a lot to call in that particular bird. I use them a lot for like a representation of energy, movement, and guidance, especially my 𝗕𝗲𝗺𝗺, if anyone's ever seen that before. So yeah, that's how I would kind of ritualize what came through from that poem, and that's another way of using my cards with the Bibliomancy. So I hope you enjoyed that. That feels like it was a hefty one for me, if I'm honest, and it could have gone so many different ways depending on the time I sat down to do it and what I got from it. But we roll with what we are given. If I've missed something and you are really keen to know, please ask away. I'm happy to answer questions. During the December pulls, I will still be around in Discord. Even if it takes me a day or so to respond, I will still be, you know, just, yeah, in and around on Discord. So ask away. Let me know if you've practiced this, if it interests you, if it made sense. And I look forward to catching you all again soon. Bye.